So, of course, let me start by thanking Delane for that kind introduction, and thank you to the board and to the wider ESPID community for this award. I'm, of course, delighted, I'm honoured, and I'm very grateful to receive this. So, talking about Bill Marshall. So, as you've just heard, Bill Marshall is Australian. He trained at the University of Melbourne, and in 1958, at the age of 29, he moved to London, where he worked in a number of junior hospital jobs, and as you've heard, ended up as a consultant at Great Ormond Street, and I think is really seen as the father of paediatric infectious diseases. And really that was about as much as I knew from previous meetings where I've heard about Bill Marshall. And I wanted to delve a bit deeper, and having done some research, the easiest place is, in fact, looking at his obituary. And the obituary actually provides you a bit of an insight into the kind of person he was. And I'd like to just read a few excerpts from that, because it really gives you a feel for the man. So it says in his obituary that his drive and energy were unbounded. He built up a first-class service in infectious diseases, preventive medicine and immunisation problems at 3 hospitals, and in particular he set up an immunisation clinic, and he was widely appreciated by the community. But apart from this, he was also found much enjoyment in soccer and found himself appointed as medical officer to 2 opposing teams, first to Arsenal and then to Chelsea football clubs. And he was obviously, reading through this obituary, he was clearly well loved by his colleagues. So one of his colleagues wrote that he had known Bill Marshall for 7 years, and he was the most unforgettable colleague. He was completely devoted to the care of his children and his friends, many of whom were postgraduate doctors from Malaysia, Singapore and Hong Kong. Children received his highest priority, and he spared no effort in the care of sick children and invariably did his night round before going to bed. And beneath the tough Aussie exterior was a shy, sensitive, warm and caring person who was happiest doing something for his friends and patients and friends. He had a passion for Sichuan food. He needed little sleep, started early, and when the phone rang apparently at 7 in the morning, it would either be the hospital or Bill Marshall, and his untimely death deprived us of a superb paediatrician, an expert in infectious diseases, and an experienced clinical tutor, and a unique and valued friend. And I really get a sense of this individual. I think it's something that we would all like to be, this kind of a person. So I obviously, despite my broad Australian accent, I did train in the UK. And in 1998, after doing my PhD here and some other jobs, I actually moved to Melbourne in Australia, what you might call a reverse Bill Marshall. And in fact, I didn't actually do that. I actually moved from England to do my fellowship in Vancouver, as you've just heard, and then before going the long way round. Now, the reason I've got this horrible photograph is it's the only one I can find from 1998, taken when our middle child, Max, was born. But we went the long way around the world to Melbourne. And a lot of people ask me, why would you move from London to Australia? And are there any differences? And essentially that's a whole other talk. Now, giving a talk, the Bill Marshall talk, is actually quite difficult. So I asked a lot of colleagues, what advice would you have for my Bill Marshall lecture? And, I had quite contradictory advice. Some people said, keep it short, but, not too short. Don't talk about yourself, but make sure you detail your whole infectious diseases career over 30 years. Keep it humorous and light-hearted, but, give some serious, deep insights into your career as a clinician scientist in infectious diseases. Others said, look, forget that all, just show us some clinical cases. We love clinical cases. But remember, this is a scientific session. Well, show us all of your research. And then I heard, except for no one's going to be interested in that. Actually, that was my imposter syndrome self thinking that. And a lot of people said, you can do anything you like, but please don't show us your TB or not TB slide collection. But I'm pleased to say that there are a lot of other people who said, you have to show us your complete TB or not TB slide collection. And also, I was told, this is your talk. And so I am going to show you for the next 90 minutes the complete, extensive TB or not TB collection, because this is still, despite being overused by me, the funniest title for anything to do with TB. And I'd like you to put your hands up if you've given a presentation or written a paper or used that title ever when discussing TB. So put your hands up so that we can all laugh at you. Even that baby's laughing. It is the most, everybody who hears this thinks they're the first, and they write a paper, they go, oh, TB or not TB, I'm the first to think of this, aren't I clever? And I'm keeping an eye on you, because each week I do a search on PubMed to see how many people have used TB or not TB. And they're now, TB or not TB, don't miss the obvious. It should have been called Don't Miss the Obvious title. And TB or not TB, that was my question. Obviously, it's not your question, it's my question. And I keep looking at this. There are now 110 results for TB or not TB. You can see it's upward trajectory, so things are looking good. These are all the ones recently. You can see there are 11 pages of this, so hang on to your seats. But there's only one paper, strangely, in 2022. Only one paper with the TB or not TB, and it's quite a contorted attempt about forehead skin temperature of TB or not TB. But I think it counts. I think it's good for 2000. Now, as you know, my obsession is actually trying to work out who was the first person to think of this title. And we thought this was the first person. Nicole, you can see at the bottom there, Nicole Ritz saw this. This paper was published in 1964. But it turns out not to be the first, because after Nicole had found this, we had another entry, 1927, from the predecessor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Andrew Marshall sent me this. You can see this was a case of TB of the scrotum, possibly the worst place that you can have TB. And this actually is the current winner. Dominic Kelly holds the record for finding this occurrence in 1906, which was a poem which started with TB or not TB. So the current record, 1906. If you find something earlier, I encourage you to Google for the rest of this talk. Please email me or tweet me. And there's a big prize, there's a very big prize if you do find something earlier than 1906, which is your name goes here on the next time I present these slides. So some people have told me that TB or not TB, that's no longer the question, which would mean I'd have nothing to talk about. But fortunately, luckily Alistair Bamford sent me that actually it is still really the question. And unfortunately now moved into other literature. It's moved into the insect literature, to be or not to be, as you can see here. And that one hasn't quite come out. We'll skip. But these are not, please don't send me these. I get regular emails from people. Don't send me any title that has to something or something, because these aren't funny. They've got nothing to do with to be. They just have to be or not to be. They just have the word to in them twice. They don't count. To mask or not to mask. Not funny. This is funny because it's a mix-up, to be or not to be. It's quite funny. Well, this actually is a complete fail. So this is a complete fail because it's just to be or not to be. That's what Shakespeare said. It's not funny. This is the mix-up. This is quite funny because they've mixed up to be or not to be. And this is just a kind of a fail, to be or not to be cell. But I will accept things that rhyme with be. So I'm happy to accept to P or not to P, and I'd like to complete the alphabet. I'm nearly there. To C or not to C, to G or not to G, to agree or not to agree, to tree or not to tree, to fee or not to fee. Who would have guessed that came from the dermatology literature? To T or not to T, which really upset me because it's spelt wrong, but then reassuringly someone has done to T or not T spelt correctly. Now, as well as these, there are what I call the complete failed opportunities. To resurface or not to resurface the patella in total knee arthroplasty. How could they have missed the obvious title? To knee or not to knee. I've written a letter to the editors suggesting this is republished as to knee or not to. And this one, so close. To plead or not to plead. Obviously, to plea or not to plea. I would like to just ask if anyone here owns the Twitter handle to be or not to be. Is this person in the room? Because I would like to have this myself. I'm very upset that this person has it. This person has deep thoughts for the void. They joined in June 2020, obviously bored during the pandemic. They're following one person. And rather upsettingly, it's not me. And they've got no followers, which might be explained by the fact they've only tweeted once. And that tweet, frankly, is pathetic. Saw some good dogs today. That is a new low in tweets. So the question is to be or not to be a clinician scientist in pediatric infectious diseases. And obviously the answer for me was to be a clinician scientist. And people say to me, this is me, aged 4-ish, earliest picture I could find, and people say, when did you first know that's what you want to do? And the evidence was that I knew from the beginning, from almost after I was born, and certainly by then, I knew that when I grow up, I want to be a professor and study the interaction between pathogen virulence factors and both the innate and adaptive immune system in the human host. Now, I show this picture actually because at this age, I was admitted to Great Ormond Street, and you can see me here in that middle bed. And interestingly, this is actually in about 1964. And it was in 1964 that Bill Marshall was appointed as a registrar and an assistant physician in Great Ormond Street. So I like to think that we might have met, and that he might have actually looked after me when I was admitted with peritonitis. Now, the second reason I think that apart from my early meeting with Bill Marshall, I think the second reason why I subliminally was encouraged to do paediatric infectious diseases, at least, is that I did my clinical training at St Mary's and then spent 5 years there doing my PhD and some postdoctoral work. And it's, of course, at St Mary's where Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and there's a plaque that you pass every day on as you go through there, and I'd encourage you to visit the museum. And you can see the original plates, and it's amazing to think that that blob is the penicillium and that those colonies are Staph aureus that used to be susceptible to penicillin. Good advertisement for antimicrobial stewardship. So I think that was a subliminal message to me. And I think the third reason was that I managed 6 months of house jobs before I couldn't stand it anymore, and so I took a job as a expedition medical officer, and I went here. And this is the Solomon Islands, that red dot and 2/3 from the left. That's the Solomon Islands, going closer into the Solomon Islands. And as you go into this island here, deep into the jungle, I was involved in this area here. And one of the projects we did actually was look at children with this disease. And I'm sure all of you have immediately diagnosed these framboise lesions or raspberry. They look like raspberries. Anybody going to shout it out? Caused by this treponema. It's mine, you're right. It's yours. It's Treponema pallidum, or Treponema pertenu, as it used to be called. And children in the Solomon Islands, this is very, very common. So this is me in 1986 in the Solomon Islands. I'm the one on the right. And if you look carefully, I'd like you to note that here, I've got these very expensive jungle boots bought in somewhere in London. But despite these, every time you got a cut on your foot or a sore, scratched yourself, it would immediately go septic. You take antibiotics, it would make no difference. All of us were covered in kind of septic sores the whole time we were there. In contrast, our guide here was bare feet walking through the jungle. Now, bare feet go very badly with machetes used to kind of cut coconuts. And when you swing a machete to cut a coconut, if you miss the coconut, you slice through your foot, as did this gentleman. And he sliced and literally divided his foot in two, right down the middle of his foot. And I was the expedition medical officer, having done 6 months of house jobs. I knew a lot about diagnosing pheochromocytomas and what to do if someone had a heart attack, but knew very little about what you do if someone slices their foot. But he said, no, nothing. So I thought about giving some antibiotics. He said, no, I didn't think. And just carried on walking with his foot, and it just healed up completely on its own. And of course, this beautifully illustrates what we saw before with the boxers, the fight between the host and bug. And I have to show you this slide because it's my favorite slide. And this animation in the late 80s was absolutely cutting edge. So I have to use it. And I've used it in almost every talk wherever I can. And I've increasingly realized actually it's oversimplified because it just has the host and the bug. And what it really needs is not just the host and the bug, but it needs the environment in what is called the Epidemiological Triangle. And the Epidemiological Triangle has made a big comeback in the last 2 years. If you search on Google, there's endless pictures of the Epidemiological Triangle because everyone's talking about it in terms of SARS-CoV-2, of course, because the host is now all of us. The virus, of course, SARS-CoV-2, and we now look at all the environmental factors that might alter what happens after your exposure. And so the media are really impressed and just can't believe that someone can survive COVID despite being 102 years old, whereas somebody who's 24 and very fit can succumb to the illness. But of course, for all of us who've been involved in infectious diseases, this is no surprise at all. We know there's this complex interaction between the bug and the host and the environment, and that explains the outcome following exposure to a pathogen. Anyway, so the Epidemiological Triangle makes a big comeback. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look on Google, I'm easily distracted, and the first thing that came to my mind was, who thought of the Epidemiological Triangle? Who was the first person? Where's the first publication? So I issue a new challenge today, because the earliest that I can find is 1959, by, if this was bigger, I could read the name, by a botanist, a very famous botanist. And this is the original Epidemiological Triangle with pathogen, host, environment, but it related to plants. But I'm sure there must be an earlier occurrence, and please send me them, because I'm now going to ditch the TB or not TB slides on popular demand and move to showing endless examples of epidemiological triangles. So, coming back to the Bill Marshall Award, one thing I'd like to do is to say that, I've obviously been the figurehead of a lot of the research that I've done, but it's completely depended on the people around me. And I really want to dedicate this award to the many clinicians and trainees, laboratory scientists and biostatisticians, the biostatisticians, the data analysts, and the clinical research nurses, and all the other members of a team and all my collaborators that make research possible. But in particular, I'd like to dedicate this to the PhD students that I've had the good fortune and pleasure of working with, and a specific subset of those who I've really been privileged to be a supervisor of. And these are the 7 awardees of ESPID fellowships over the last 20 years who've come to Melbourne to work with me. And these are an extraordinary bunch of people. And I'd like to just go through very briefly their work to kind of illustrate really the benefits of an ESPID fellowships. I know these are a very big part of the budget. When I was on the board, it used to be talked about a lot, but I'd like to say they are really important for not just the research that's carried out by these individuals, but also for those individuals' career, and then what they go on to do and how they go on to mentor people in the future. So what I'm going to do is summarize each of these individuals' work. No one wants their PhD summarized in 30 seconds, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'd like you to know that they did do more than what I'm going to tell you in the next 30 seconds. And I've gone to show you what they've gone on to do in the future. So Penelope got an award in 2000. Penelope Bryant got an award in 2003. She worked on acute rheumatic fever in the indigenous population of Australia. And she used gene expression arrays to show that there was a difference in the immune response in those who were susceptible and those who were not susceptible to acute rheumatic fever, and that there was a difference in the response to rheumatogenic versus non-rheumatogenic group A strep. So there's 5 years and 30 seconds. Now, what I was told is that the principle of success is drive, focus, and determination. And specifically, everyone said you must focus on one thing only. And my wife says, you're useless at that because you basically need blinkers. You're just continually distracted. And that's because I think everything is interesting. If you look at anything, basically, it becomes interesting. And my defense is that there's now quite a lot of literature saying that distraction helps your creativity. So I encourage all my students to have at least one other project that distracts them and do something else. And in Penelope's case, this was my interest in sleep in the immune system. And Penelope's written a couple of papers on how sleep and sleep deprivation interacts with the autonomic and the immune system and its importance in immune defense. And particularly like her recent review in the PIDJ, the ESPID journal, which is called Sleep Infection, No Snooze, You Lose. Now, secondly, we come to Tom Connell, who came in 2005, and he looked and he worked in South Africa, where he looked at the performance of interferon gamma release assays in children with suspected TB and showed that those who clearly had latent TB by virtue of very large TST reactions often had negative interferon gamma release assays. Now, he did some of this work in Cape Town. Now, it was very brave because it was the same time that I did my sabbatical in Cape Town, and he came to live with me and my family. That's pretty brave to live for a few months with your supervisor, because you have to behave. I mean, the supervisor have to behave, not the student in this particular case. But here's my family, and I asked my wife, this is in 2005, you happy to go to Cape Town? And she said, sure, so long as it's safe. Holly, my daughter, said, we're going to study TB. What is TB? To which Felix replies, it's the thing we watch The Simpsons on. But the reason I show this slide is because, of course, I would really like to use this opportunity to thank my family, and particularly my wife. So my wife, Henny Williams, is also a clinical academic, and as well as being the mother of my children, she's my best friend. And also, I would say that I really want to use this opportunity to thank her for all the support, the advice and encouragement that she's really given me over the last 25 years. So, moving on back to Tom, what was he distracted by? He was distracted by blood culture bottles, and he showed that when you send a blood culture, by virtue of spending a long time weighing a lot of different blood culture bottles before and after their use, showed that many times a blood culture comes back with virtually no blood on it, and so therefore a negative blood culture has very little negative predictive value. Be careful about negative blood cultures. There may have been no blood in the bottle. Nicole Ritz, she came in 2006, and she worked on a trial where we looked at the immune response to different strains of BCG given to neonates in Melbourne, and showed that the immune response to different strains is indeed different. Now, Nicole, I'd like to use this opportunity for a public apology for making you do this table when you did your review of strains. Every time I look at this table, I think, I'm so sorry that you had to create that table. Here is your public apology. Now, because Nicole's very careful, she's assiduous, as well as doing the immune assays that she was part of the trial, she also measured everybody's scar and showed that there was a difference in the scar size and rate between those who'd had different strains. And that proved to be very useful because subsequently, Laure Pité, who came here on a Swiss National Foundation Fellowship, came to Australia on a Swiss National Foundation Fellowship, used samples that had been collected by Nicole and has recently published that, against what was previously thought, that actually your BCG skin reaction size and characteristics do correlate with your T-cell immune response. Meanwhile, back at Nicole, she published this fantastic title, To BCG or Not to BCG, which is almost better than to be or not TB. And she's also published To TST or Not TST, and that counts because it rhymes. And since then, Amanda Gui, who now works with me in Melbourne, published this, To X-ray or Not to X-ray. I agree it's not so good, but it was quite hard for us to get this published because when Archives of Disease gave us their decision on this manuscript, they wrote, I wonder if you want to review the title of your paper. Some authors feel the phrase TB or not TB and its variations is rather overused in the literature. Dr. Gui, perhaps you could ask the senior author for advice. She asked the senior author, who said the title was perfect. Whilst I'm talking about Amanda, I'll just highlight this paper that will be out in the next week or two in Pediatric Infectious Diseases Journal, which describes an approach to the management of children with COVID-19. It has a very nice algorithm to use to decide which drugs to use in those very few children who require drug treatment, and there's also a poster about that here. Moving on to Mark Tabroyga, who came to Melbourne in 2007 and whose work you'll be very familiar with here, I think, in ESPID, showing that cytokines other than interferon can be used to diagnose tuberculosis infection in children, and in particular to separate those with latent and active disease. Mark is very easily distracted. He's the perfect supervisee for someone like me. So he got somehow distracted to looking at the treatment of head lice. And he published this paper. And I had a very big part in this paper because I contributed that head louse. Because you can see here, this is an adult head louse. Source, head louse, courtesy of Master Felix Curtis, who is my youngest son. And this really is his head louse. And Felix said, you're more than, I'm happy for you to use this picture in the talk, but please make it absolutely clear that I don't have head lice now. So he definitely does not have head lice now. However many years later that is. Okay, Felix, you're clear. Mark was also distracted, very interested in UTI and meningitis, and also recurrent meningitis, and he did an amazing systematic review. Very proud of the 200, it's too small on my screen, 200 and something public references, an enormous number of references to go through. Bridget Frayne came in 2013. And she worked on the MISBEAR trial where we randomized over 1,200 neonates to receive BCG or not so that we could look at the off-target effects both on their clinical outcomes, as you can see there, and immunological outcomes, and create a very large biobank, which Bridget used to show that the BCG vaccine does alter cytokine responses both at 7 days and at later on at a few months later. And she showed both differences in multiple cytokines and in cytokine responses. Moving on to Petra Zimmerman, came in 2016. She also worked on samples from the MISBEAR trial. She showed that BCG alters the immune response to scheduled vaccines. She also showed that there, against what you might expect, there isn't a clear correlation between your response to one vaccine and another, beautifully shown in this heat map. We have made this heat map into a rug. If anybody wants to purchase one of these after the meeting, it will be available. Petra is also the queen of systematic reviews. This is my favourite, factors that influence the immune response to vaccination. And I think her proudest achievement is that she managed to beat Mark Tabroyga in the number of references that were included in her systematic review. I think 582 really is a new record. Probably not for Petra. Petra's also gone on to write a suite of papers on COVID-19, which I'd encourage you to look at, including quite a few on long COVID, the controversial subject of long COVID. Finally, I end on Christy Noble, who's arrived in 2022 to work on samples from the BRACE trial, where we've randomized nearly 7,000 healthcare workers in 5 countries to BCG or placebo to look at whether we can impact the severity of COVID-19 and the immune response to their vaccines. And the results of those will be out very shortly. So finally, to end, I really would like to thank a few individuals. If I had time, I would show you my whole Agar art collection. I can only show you this subset. And the first person that I'd really like to thank is from my time at St Mary's, and of course Mike Levine. So Mike Levine was my supervisor, and Mike Levine really is the clinician scientist's clinician scientist. He is an extraordinary man, very talented, and it really has been an inspiration, not just to mine, but so many people who've then gone on to supervise people who've then gone on to supervise. It's almost like the great-grandfather supervisor at the top of the tree. So a massive thank you to Mike Levine. When I arrived in his lab, Rob Hyden and Nigel Klein taught me what a pipette was. Mike Jacobs, and who the heck is that? Must be, oh, it's Andy, yeah. Mike Jacobs and Andy Pollard arrived shortly afterwards and have now both made us feel real underachievers. A number of other individuals there, Simon, Jennifer, Hermione and Beata. Actually, Jennifer reminded me just yesterday, I showed her the first ever email she saw being sent. I've apologised because her life would have been much easier if I hadn't shown her email. And then I'd like to thank David Shifley, who really was my mentor in Vancouver. He really taught me how to do clinical consults. And finally, Willem Hannekom in South Africa, who really helped with the TB diagnostic work. And of course, I have to thank my colleagues with whom I've worked for the last, I can't remember how many years, 15, 16 years on the IIC, Infection and Immunity course meeting in Oxford, which has always been great fun. No more great fun than when we took this meeting to Perth in Australia. I made the big mistake, never make this mistake, of going mountain bike riding with Adam and Andrew. But you can see here, this was the initial research that Andy was doing on the MERS vaccine. And the camel's thinking, if you think MERS is bad, wait till you see SARS-CoV-2. Finally, obviously, I'd like to thank the really great clinical team that I work with, our consultants and fellows in Melbourne. And you can see we've got some very bright ideas. Finally, big thanks to my research team. With most of the time we've been, of course, spent looking at each other like this. But thank you to all of those people. And I end, of course, you have to end by thanking your family, who you can see that over the last kind of 25 years, that he hasn't really changed much at all, look pretty much the same. There's one person, though, who I don't want to thank, and that is Isabel. So Isabel Y tweeted after I'd just done a very innocent tweet saying, in children, COVID is much more mild than it is in adults. Said, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, like Nigel Twit, my Twitter handle, who seek to downplay and minimize the risk to kids of COVID-19 and long COVID. And I pretty mild tweet before that. And to my amazement, Felix, who no longer has headlights, by the way, Felix, who rarely replies, came to my defense and he wrote, yeah, Isabel, I'm sure you know a lot more about COVID in kids. Not like he's been an infectious disease paediatrician in 35 years. Hashtag stay in your lane. Hashtag beware of Isabel. And perhaps I should actually apologise to Isabel, because when I went back to look at her feed, she's been suspended. So anyway, on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thanks again for the honour of this award. Thank you.